Chapter 4 starts out originally asking about Jewish identity. What does it mean to be Jewish? And this is not a simple question to answer. There's really a number of different ways you could answer this. You could say it's to belong to a religion, to practice that religion. But is everybody who's Jewish observant? There are many secular Jews. What makes them Jewish then? You know, a lot of the people who actually got rounded up in the Holocaust didn't think of themselves as Jewish. They'd actually converted at one point or another. What else could make you Jewish? Yeah?
Being born to Jewish parents.
Yeah, and the rule of thumb is it's descent through the mother. Although you notice that the anti-Semites have not observed that rule. They say anybody who's got Jewish blood is Jewish. So you've got ethnicity, you've got religion. Does that cover the entire gamut? Culture fits in with that. Somebody could be culturally Jewish. They could be adopted into a Jewish family that's not religious, and they're not actually ethnically Jewish, you know, but people might consider them a Jew. A lot of it has to do with this long-term narrative or story. And he talks about different terms that people use, Jewish, Hebrew, and where they come from. We don't really need to worry about that. Where he starts out with is in terms of these people called the Patriarchs. The beginning of the story would be people like Abraham. And Abraham doesn't start out Jewish, does he? He starts out living in one of the, what we nowadays call Iraq, in one of these towns along the Tigris and the Euphrates. And according to the story, God says, leave that town, which to him would be sort of like, you know, a lot of people who grew up in New York, there's a lot of people this way to Chicago, they can't imagine living anywhere else. They're like, I totally miss the city, you know, and imagine like sticking them up in Schenectady or in Buffalo or even, you know, not even a city, just some little tiny town. And they're like, oh, that's like death to me. I don't feel that way because I grew up in the countryside, but so I know its charms. Imagine that for Abraham. Everything he knows is in this city. And this God says to him, all right, I want you to take off. And try to take some of your relatives with you. Try to talk them into that. That's the beginning of the story. And he does it. He follows the call, and he has all sorts of adventures that you can read about in the book of Genesis. Some of them quite interesting and amusing, some of them harrowing. And he ends up being promised this holy land, right? And when he's an old man, he has two sons, Ishmael first by his wife's handmaiden, and then Isaac, and the Jewish people descends through Isaac, who, by the way, God tells him at one point, sacrifice him. I mean, this is a story that has got lots of twists and turns. Well worth reading if you haven't done it yet. Isaac, and then there's stories with him, and Jacob, also known as Israel, and Jacob has a bunch of kids, one of whom is named Joseph. Each one of these are what we call patriarchs. And what is a patriarch? A father figure who is important, who's an example. Joseph is the one, by the way, who gets them to go to Egypt. He says, you know, because there's a lot of famine at the time, he says, I got a good position down here, why don't you all come over here? And they do. That's where the story of the Exodus comes in. So then we get this guy, Moses, one of the most important of the patriarchs. And it goes on from there. And your book talks about a lot of these stories. Gives you a little thumbnail sketch of them. Why is Moses so particular Other than, he kills the Egyptian and Charlton Heston played him. He's a tough guy, by the way. Moses is a tough guy. He beats up people, keeps order. Kind of an interesting guy. They say he's mild. They use the word meek for him, but if you actually read Exodus, he gets involved in some scrapes. Why is he so important? What happens through him?
10 Commandments.
Actually, not just the 10 Commandments, but all the rest of them, because he's traditionally understood as the guy who receives the Torah and writes it down. Yeah, there's what the book calls a theophany, which means God appearing to somebody. And the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words, the Decalogia, come out of that. And those are understood as being normative for Jewish life. In fact, the entire Torah, as a way of living, is supposed to come about that, through that. And what else happens with this Moses guy? Kills an Egyptian, takes off. Is that the end of the story? Yeah.
Doesn't he free the people?
Yeah, he comes back and says, let's get out of here. And, the Hebrews at that time are not having a good time. They're slaves, and the Egyptians are really oppressing them. So they say, let's get out of here. And they do. And then what happens? You remember the rest of the story? Comes to a turning point, doesn't it? Because the Pharaoh at first, there's all these plagues before that, and that's why they said, yeah, you can go. And then the Pharaoh says, I changed my mind. Go get those slaves and bring them back. And they're getting them with chariots and guys who have armor, and they're just going to kill them. They're going to slaughter them. So things look pretty dim. What happens then? Yeah.
It goes right through the Red Sea.
Yeah, and this is one of the central events that your book talks about, this experience of divine deliverance. That's what the book of Exodus is centered around. This is what he calls a root experience. Every year, this is supposed to be sort of remembered and reenacted. A miracle is supposed to take place, and this is not only like, well, thank God that we actually got out of that scrape. Now the Egyptians will leave us alone. And it's not the end of the story, too. They run into this people here and have trouble with these guys, and the Amalekites attack them. And you should read the whole book. Something about the nature of God is revealed in this. That's part of what he's talking about here. And there's three things that he emphasizes, the textbook writer. He says, in contrast with the religious systems of the other ancient Near Eastern peoples, the God of the Hebrew people was the only God with whom they're allowed to have a relationship. So when we talk about this question of, we should put this in here, Jewish identity tied in with monotheism. Monotheism connected with Yahweh. Jehovah, by the way, is a sort of, there's a whole story on how people want to say Jehovah for Yahweh. It has to do with the way it was written down and how it made its way into German and then English. We can talk about that story some other time. But they're referring to the same thing. So Yahweh is the one God that the Jews are supposed to have a relationship with. What's unique about this? He's concerned with human history. If you look at the religious systems of other people, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, people that are around them, the Greeks later on, these gods are not particularly concerned with history, with human history, with particular events. There will be important stories where, Zeus came down over here, and usually Zeus is knocking somebody up, and then a hero gets born. That's the way, 99% of the stories with Zeus end up. That's where the Greek heroes usually come from. Every once in a while, somebody else will, some other god will do it. But they're not things like, he rescued a whole people by parting the sea and telling them to get out of Egypt and then took them to this promised land. That's historical stuff. The other thing that's important that he points out is Yahweh is understood as being a personal God, personally connected with the individual people who he cares for, is communicating with, however you want to put it. That was something quite different than a lot of ancient religions. Quite a few of the ancient religions, there wasn't this sense of being in an individual relationship with God. And the relationship was understood in terms of this concept of covenant. When you make a covenant, it's an agreement between two parties. So, what would be some examples of this? Nowadays we have contracts. If I know an example. When do you guys sign contracts all the time in your daily life that you probably don't read? And I'm not criticizing you because I don't read them either.
iTunes.
iTunes and what else? What's the broader thing?
Oh, I don't know what you would call those.
Anytime that you do what?
License agreements or something.
License and upgrade agreements, right? iTunes will come out with a new version. You gotta click the I agree thing. Websites do this. You are actually entering into a legal contract. Most of them. How many of you actually read all of the things that you're clicking? How many of you read like the first paragraph at least? I do that. None of you read the first paragraph? Only a few of you do. You should at least read the first paragraph. So it's not something like, I agree to pay you $1,000 a month or something like that. Those probably wouldn't be legally binding anyway, but those are contracts. They're giving something, you're giving something, there's an agreement that's being made. With the Jewish religion, and this carries forth into Christianity, this notion of covenant is really central. Yahweh says that he is going to care for this people, that he will be their protector, their guide, he will lead them through the right way to live, but they've got to do some other things in return. They can't just, say, oh, thanks for the gift, all right, see you later. They're supposed to be connected with him. They're supposed to be actually living out the law. And, if you read these biblical books like Judges or, the books of the prophets, you see constant back and forth or the books of Kings too. People are not doing what they're supposed to do, and then, the contract has to be somehow reinforced or reworked. The book of Hosea, if you only read one book in terms of covenant, that would be a great book to read because it's looked at in terms of a marriage. And Hosea is actually told to go off and marry a harlot, what we nowadays call a whore, to be his wife. Why? Because that's the way Israel behaves towards Yahweh. And there's a whole story there that I don't want to ruin for you by going into that. This is actually a good place to talk now about the actual texts. Again, we already talked about the Torah, right? These first 5 books of the Bible that includes these stories, these legal codes. What else is there? There's historical writings. And, like most ancient history, it's a mixture of history and some reinterpretation and ideology and sometimes wishful thinking, but there is actually a historical core for a lot of these texts, like the book of Judges, the book of Joshua, Chronicles, Kings, those sorts of things. And they're sort of narrating the story of what's going on between Yahweh and the people of Israel and Judea. By the way, they also refer to books that we don't have. Oftentimes in the books of Kings it'll say, yeah, this guy did this stuff, and if you want to know more about him, go and look in this book over here, which no longer exists, unfortunately. The prophetic books. Oops. There we go. The prophets are people, if we look at the lexical meaning of this term, who speak for God. Quite often they didn't feel like doing that. A great example of that would be Jeremiah, who really was very reluctant to be a prophet, and because he knew that it was going to get him in all sorts of trouble. Because generally, what are prophets telling people? Are they saying, all right, good job. There were prophets who were doing that. Those were the false prophets. What are prophets usually doing? They're going around and telling people what?
Like what they're doing wrong and what they need to change or...
Yeah, they're giving them a bad performance review. They're saying, you're screwing up. Here's what you're supposed to be doing. Here's what you're supposed to be doing, A. Here's what you're actually doing, B. Notice the big gap between these. By the way, the guy upstairs is not real happy about that. And some things are going to happen if you don't actually get this discrepancy reconciled. I'm putting it in very business-like talk here, but that's essentially what's going on in a lot of these books. And then it tended to turn around things like, you're abusing the poor. You're not supposed to be charging people all this interest that you're charging them and basically putting them into slavery through debt, and you're doing that and God doesn't like it. That's what some of the books of the prophets are talking about. You're not supposed to be oppressing the widow and the orphan. It's easy to do that because there's nobody to protect them, but that's not what you're supposed to be doing. There's all sorts of things along those lines. Some of them have to do with worship of other gods, adopting practices from other peoples, but a lot of them have to do with ethics. A lot of them have to do with failures on the part of the Jewish people to live up to that. And by the way, the prophets are not just sent to, in these books, are not just sent to the Jews. Any of you remember the story of Jonah? The guy gets swallowed by the whale. Remember that one from Sunday school? He was a perfect example of somebody who didn't want to be a prophet. He actually, whatever happens with this sea creature, why does that happen? Because God says, I want you to go here, and he actually goes in the exact opposite direction, by sea. And then, they throw him overboard, and he gets swallowed, and then he gets spit up right where he's supposed to be. And where is he supposed to be? It's not Israel. Anyone know? It's not even remotely close to it. Nineveh, with these dirty Assyrians who have no conception whatsoever about Yahweh and worship all these other gods. And he's got a reasonable case here. He's like, why the hell are you sending me here? It's one thing to be a prophet to your people, but you're sending me to these jokers over here? And so he actually delivers the message, and these guys actually follow it, and then he's ticked off. He's like, you were going to smite them. I was waiting to see that because they weren't going to do it. I knew they weren't going to do what you said, but then they did it. What's wrong with this picture? And then God says to him, not a very satisfying answer, I'm God. If I want to save them, I can. It's not just the Jews that I care about. It's also these poor Ninevites over here. So it's a very interesting prophetic story. That's the sort of stuff that you'll find in these prophetic books. And then finally there's the other stuff, often called the wisdom literature. And this includes the book of Job. Any of you ever read the book of Job? Sometimes you actually have to read it in literature classes. It's actually very philosophical. The Song of Songs, one of the first bits of erotic literature that you're going to find in one of the few ones you're going to find in the Bible. The metaphors are quite juicy. It's about marriage. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Psalms. The Psalms were used for the rituals in the temple. They're actually songs. Some other books he talks about that didn't make it into the later Jewish canon of Scripture would be the book of the books of the Maccabees, the first and second one. Those are historical books about the struggle against the Greeks. Other wisdom literature like the Book of Wisdom and the Book of Sirach, one of the longest books, also called Ecclesiasticus. The Book of Tobit, which is another story book. A few other bits and pieces of some books. And there's a whole story why those didn't make it in, but I think I'll sort of reserve that for a little bit later on when we talk about Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. Now, let's shift gears a bit, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through this. We talked about the Patriarchs. We've talked about these texts and all this narrative stuff. Now I want to talk about some history. And the history begins in what he's talking about with what we're going to call the diaspora. And remember, I used this term last class. Diaspora come from the word, to cast seed or cast something widely. And it wasn't just, the African slaves who were spread all over the place through the Caribbean, South America, North America. The Jewish people long before that were spread all over the place. And why was that? Well, part of it had to do with being conquered. Judea as a kingdom was conquered by one of the great Middle Eastern powers at the time, and a lot of the Jews were carried off in captivity, what was called the Babylonian captivity. This was a common practice, by the way, in ancient imperial administration. You would take a lot of the people you'd think would be the troublemakers off of their land, disconnect them from that, put them somewhere else where they'd stay out of trouble. So, the Babylonians were just basically doing, empire ruling 101 by doing that. In any case, the Jews end up getting scattered all over the place. Some of them fight as mercenary soldiers, like I mentioned. There was actually a Jewish temple that they've discovered in Elephantine, Egypt, which is very far south. Why was it there? Because there had been a long-standing presence of Jewish mercenary soldiers guarding that area. Jews are spread all over the place. Throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Persian Empire, they scattered. And he talks about fitting in as best as they could with the host cultures in which they dwelt. He also talks about a couple other things. And I'm going to pass around the little book, which is not in very good shape, so don't knock it around too much. This is a Septuagint. This is a copy of the Jewish texts, but all in Greek. Because one of the main places that the Jews spread out through was the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, Latin was only spoken in the West. Through most of the Roman Empire, it was Greek that was spoken. And so this was somebody else's, and they cared for it very well before I got it. And I got my hands on it. And this is when I want to read Jewish texts in Greek, because I can't read Hebrew. This is what I read them in. So I'm going to pass it around. You can take a look at it. It's very old. And he talks about the importance of this. This, by the way, is going to play a role in the conversation about why the canons of Scripture are different. But I'll put that off until next class. He then talks about two main groups of, you might say, Jews in the diaspora. Where did I put my pen? There it is. And he does remark on the importance of Babylon, or what we would call the Middle East. Until recently, there's been a huge Jewish presence throughout the Middle East. But Jews are also spread in two other very important ways. And he talks about the... let's get this to stay. There we go. The Sephardic Jews. And what we're talking about there is North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking about nowadays Spain and Portugal, right? Then he also talks about the... It's always hard to... I'm so bad with spelling. There we go. Ashkenazim. Yeah, already. There we go. The Ashkenazic Jews. And these are scattered originally in the Roman Empire and then up into what's going to become Germany, and then spread to France, Russia, Poland, Lithuania is particularly important. He doesn't mention this in the book, but actually the history of languages fits in here too. You guys have all heard of Yiddish, right? Yiddish is actually, although a lot of people don't like if you say this, it's actually a dialect of German. Some German speakers pretend like they can't actually understand it, but it's pretty close. And Yiddish was something that was spoken by the Ashkenazim because they were in that environment. It was a dialect. There was another dialect called Ladino, which was actually, it's got sort of the same relation between Yiddish and German, between Ladino and the Romance languages. And it was another dialect that was used by the Sephardim. What do you remember about your medieval Renaissance history? What happened in Spain? Yeah.
The Inquisition.
A little bit later on, that's part of what goes on. What's the broader thing? Yeah.
Muslim Empire conquered Spain.
Yeah, first the Muslims conquered Spain, and originally the Sephardim are there under Muslims. They weren't always totally enlightened. You know, Moses Maimonides actually had to get the hell out of Spain and went as far as Egypt because he was being persecuted by Muslims in Spain. But for the most part, the Muslims were pretty take it or leave it, very easygoing. What happens after that? Who takes over Spain? Yeah.
Isabella and that dude.
Ferdinand? They're a little bit later on, but they're part of this process of what's called the Reconquista, the reconquest by Christians, Roman Catholics, of Muslim Spain. And when they come in, they actually kick the Jews out. And so a lot of these Sephardim go to a place that's, by the way, at that time actually Spanish, which we call the Netherlands, or Holland. After a while, the Dutch, got sick of the Spaniards and kicked them out too, and became independent. And from there, they go to Dutch colonies as well. What was an important Dutch colony? If we want to take this back to America. I'll give you a hint. We're sitting in it right now. New York. Yeah, at that time, it was not New York, but New Amsterdam. Very good. And so some of the Jews actually end up in the American continent through this long process of getting out of Spain and going to a freer place, the Netherlands, and finding things that would work out that way. There's a number of differences between these two groups, and part of it is their history. These are the ones that suffer because of the Holocaust, for the most part. There's a huge Jewish presence for a long time in Germany, France, Russia, Poland, Lithuania. And as anti-Semitism rises or becomes more virulent in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, I should back up a little bit. He talks a bit about ghettos. These were areas where Jews were, basically confined to. They couldn't be part of the larger society. In Enlightened times, the Sephardim didn't undergo that sort of segregation. But in these countries, the Jews tended to be segregated off into ghettos or living in villages that they called shtetls. And what ends up happening is really a few elements to the story. A new movement, actually two new movements come out of this that we're going to just very quickly touch on. One is the Hasidim, who we'll talk about more later on. Hasidic Judaism really comes in large part out of this area, and it's a reaction against rabbinical You could say rationalism or enlightenment. Hasidism is a mystical movement. Rationalism or enlightenment, as the European Enlightenment is going on, a lot of Jews are saying, hey, Judaism is perfectly suited to this. It's a religion that's monotheistic, all about ethics, and so they try to sort of strip away all the cultural or ceremonial elements to it. The other thing that occurs that's very important in this respect is anti-Semitism, eventually culminating in the Holocaust, where about 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. That radically changed Jewish demographic dynamics. Where do the majority of Jews today live? Anyone know? There's two places, two countries. Yeah.
Here in Israel?
Here in Israel, yeah. In large part because European Jewry was, for the most part, wiped out. By the way, the Nazis were not the only ones to be doing this. A lot of Jews found their ways into the Soviet gulags. So, there was persecution taking place. There's been an evacuation in large part from other parts of the world towards Israel and towards the United States as anti-Semitism has arisen in other places as well. And the last thing to mention that he brings up is this term Zionism. Zionism means this notion that Israel should be a state. The Jews should have their own homeland the way that the Czechs do, or the way that the Germans do, or the way that the Somalians do. Pick whoever you like. And that they'll only really be safe if they have that. There was for a long time no homeland. That was only recently created. We're talking about in the last century, after the Second World War. But this Zionist movement was around for, and going pretty strong for about a century before that. That's why there was, an impetus, bless you, towards that in the first place. So we have all this history wrapped up in one. I know we've covered a lot of stuff, and your head's probably spinning a little bit. But try to digest it.